Thank you. There's a really primal level on which it makes a lot of sense that the years after 9/11 would see a real explosion in horror movies, right? Even though, as Aviva mentioned, there was this space where we didn't know what the hell was going to happen next, but we were like, no more horror movies. The New Yorker and lots of other places predicted the death of the genre, the reason that these make sense as the success and explosion of the genre has to do with what we experience. And, you know, standing in the middle of Fifth Avenue on 9/11 and watching buildings fall, you kept hearing it's like a movie, it's like a movie. In the media, you kept hearing it's like a movie, it's like a movie. That was the frame of reference that so many folks had, right? Especially folks who hadn't had the experience of dealing with state terror or oppression or war or occupation or institutionalized racism or any number of like the real horror that lots of folks deal with on a day-to-day basis. So for lots of folks, this was the only frame of reference they had to process this information. So then compare standing in Fifth Avenue watching buildings fall with sitting in a movie theater and watching Cloverfield, where a giant monster just comes out of the ocean and starts knocking buildings down. It's very different, right? You have closure, you have an explosion at the end that kills the monster, although maybe there will be a sequel. So horror films give us the trauma that we've experienced, but it gives us that trauma with closure. And sometimes, you know, this is the compromise we make when we consume art that tries to interface with politics and reality, right? On the one hand, it simplifies it and makes us able to process it, and everything's good and happy at the end, or at least we understand it. You know, the Cloverfield monster, you don't need to understand the history of US intervention in the Middle East to get the monster in Cloverfield. You don't need to know about foreign policy. You don't need to think about it as a complex thing. It's just a monster, and what could be simpler than a monster? So I think that horror movies give us this space, but it's a very limited space. So I think part of what's really interesting about the book is the way we can explore, and the different contributors did a great job of exploring different aspects of the genre, and looking at what we can find there versus what's not there, and what horror movies give us and what they don't. And I had other things to say, but you want me to talk about my essay now? Okay. I'll do that. So one of the things that we saw in the years after 9/11 was, like Aviva mentioned, this growing conservatism in the United States, and the mainstream media, and the rise of Fox News, and the sudden really narrowness of political discourse, right? The Dixie Chicks, of all the radical voices in the country, the Dixie Chicks got in big trouble for what was ultimately a really harmless comment about George Bush and being ashamed to be from the same state as him because they were anti-war. Maybe that wasn't such a harmless statement, but you know, this was big news, and there were CD burning parties where people would bring their Dixie Chicks CDs and burn them, and they were just hounded in the media. And so we were in this space. I mean, I think this was true for lots of folks, right? That there was no real conversation happening. I think a lot of us were sort of feeling like there are conversations that need to happen, that 9/11 really sort of necessitates, right? Why did this happen? What is going on here? But that those conversations weren't happening in the media. And at the same time as those conversations weren't happening, horror movies were having those conversations, right? So at the same time as the Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay scandals were happening, we had films like Saw and Hostel and Saw 2 and Hostel 2, and I think they're up to Saw 6 now, which they... Seven. So, you know, the rise of this genre that some people have called torture porn, right? Where it's really just about observing people suffer harm, right? So that's interesting, right? Because you couldn't. There was this whole controversy about using the word torture, and yet here we have movies about torture where we can explore this anxiety. So I think one of the interesting things that this growing conservatism has highlighted for me, and one of the things that I tried to talk about in my essay in the book, has to do with the queer monster, right? There's a brilliant and glorious heritage in the horror film of the queer monster. You know, because in classical Hollywood cinema and classical narrative and under patriarchy in general, queerness is monstrous, right? If you desire differently, if you are not gender conforming, that is itself monstrous, right? So generally, throughout the history of horror, you had monsters that were coded in subtle or not subtle ways as being queer, right? Frankenstein, one of the first major Hollywood horror films, you have this actor, I think, was Colin Clive gay? I think he was. Dr. Frankenstein is very flamboyant, and he wants to create a man, but he doesn't want to. He doesn't, and yeah, and the director, of course, was gay, and Dr. Frankenstein doesn't want to marry this woman and have a baby with her. He wants to make a man on his own, and so throughout the history of the horror film, there's something queer in monstrosity, right? Dracula, the vampire movies, it's all about some kind of sex that's not the kind of sex we're used to, so it's pretty scary. Right up until Psycho, which sort of inaugurated the modern horror film, and Norman Bates as this sort of, I don't even know what the LGBTQI what initial Norman Bates would be, because it's like this weird straight person's nightmare of what queerness is. Of here's this dude who is his mother and dresses up like her and murders people, right? And so this is a glorious heritage for me as a queer person, and I don't think I'm the only one who sort of really loved that. I mean, I love when Norman Bates bursts into the room in a dress and a wig waving a knife. When I was 9 years old, I loved that. There's something about when you don't see yourself in movies, when you do see yourself, you're like, awesome. So I think that there's always been this, and this is not my observation, right? There's been a lot of great stuff written about that, and Harry Benshoff, who's a great writer who is in our book, wrote a great book called Monsters from the Closet that explores this in greater detail. But there's a great history of that. But what sort of happened over the past 30, 40 years that the LGBT liberation movement has had certain kinds of success has been we've really seen the queer monster die out. And that as queerness has become increasingly assimilated and mainstreamed in certain ways, we've seen the monster die out, right? So in 1978-79, when Cruising came out, and it's about a murderer who's gay and who's murdering people in the LGBT leather scene. This is like, it's a queer monster, right? It's a murderer. It's not like a vampire, but it's a monster. And there were protests, right? For the first time, there was real pushback against this idea of a queer monster, and so there were disruptions of shooting. Shooting was happening in Greenwich Village, and LGBTQ folks were protesting, and they actually ended up, in some cases, doubling the budget for the shoots because they kept having to stop for the day and set up again. So that they were in some ways really, really successful. And then throughout the 80s, we still had some queer monsters. Dressed to Kill by Brian De Palma has a sort of Psycho-esque killer queer monster. And then that brings us up to Silence of the Lambs, which has Buffalo Bill, another sort of straight person's nightmare of what queerness is, right? Like, oh my God, he's tucking his penis, I don't know what he's doing. So we had this very different queer monster for a very different historic moment, and then a very different queer response to that queer monster, right? So at that point, we already had GLAAD, Gay and Lesbian Anti-Defamation something, and so by that point, the response was like protest by press release, right? They sent a press release. They sort of made statements to the press. They sort of said, this isn't acceptable, this is bad, and then it is, and so as I just feel like, and in my essay, I'm hopefully do a much more articulate job of talking about how the queer monster, as queers have become assimilated, as like a certain kind of like straight acting, mostly male, mostly white, gay person, not other types of LGBTQ, have become sort of mainstream and accepted and assimilated. We've really seen the gay monster disappear from the map. And I actually think that's a tragedy and a really sad thing, because with it has died this sort of understanding of queerness as a radical identity, as something that is monstrous, and monstrous in the sense of it's a threat to patriarchy, and something that all the oppression that patriarchy is part of, that queerness has the power to challenge all of that. And as queer identity has included less and less of that, the queerness has less power to sort of challenge things. So that's a way oversimplification of an essay that is itself an oversimplification. So if folks in here want to critique or challenge or yell at me, I'm going to be here for a while after the event so we can chat.